Luffy started his journey relying on creativity and rubber powers, but what if he had the strongest paramecia from the start? What if Luffy had the Quake fruit instead? How would that change his path in One Piece? Luffy's days in Fuchsia Village were full of fun, mischief, and trouble. Just like always, he would run around after Shanks and his pirate crew, dreaming of becoming a pirate himself. The red-haired pirates laughed, drank, and shared stories. Luffy admired all of them, especially Shanks. One day, as the pirates celebrated in the bar, a strange box sat on the table. Luffy was already pretty annoyed that Shanks wasn't letting him join his crew and become a pirate. So when he found a fruit in the box, he promptly picked it up and began eating it. The weird pear-shaped fruit with swirls on it tasted absolutely awful. Then, the room fell silent as the pirates froze. Shanks stared at Luffy with wide eyes, slowly dropping his drink. Luffy tilted his head, confused. Why was everyone staring at him? Then the floor shook, tables tipped over, glasses shattered, and cracks began forming on the walls. The other people began to scream as the whole building trembled like a small earthquake had just struck the village bar. Luffy stood there, scratching his head, when Shanks rushed over and picked him up before yelling at the crew to get everyone outside before the place collapsed. Once outside, Shanks sat Luffy down and explained how dangerous the fruit was. Luffy had eaten the Quake fruit, a fruit with the power to generate vibrations that could cause massive earthquakes. It was known as one of the strongest devil fruits in the world. Shanks looked extremely worried and warned Luffy about the power he now possessed. Luffy nodded, even though he didn't really understand what it all meant. Still, Shanks left for a trip, and days passed with Luffy trying his best to listen to Shanks. Unfortunately, though, trouble wasn't very far away. Luffy saw Higuma the mountain bandit, who had previously humiliated Shanks, talking down about him once again. Overhearing them, Luffy grew outraged on Shanks' behalf and impulsively attacked the bandits. Annoyed at him, they beat him up while Luffy did his best to keep his power under control. Luffy remained defiant, though, and soon enough, the village mayor arrived. Worried that this could lead to the mayor getting hurt, Luffy's emotions finally flew out of control, and he punched Higuma in the gut with his Quake powers. The impact was catastrophic. The air started to shake around them, and tremors went through the earth as Higuma let Luffy go and was blasted into a nearby wall. Shanks heard the trouble and quickly made his way there to find a few houses broken down and huge cracks in the earth. Higuma himself was buried in the rubble of the wall he crashed into. Shanks stood there, hands on his head, staring at the mess. The crew gaped at Luffy, who was apologizing for what he had done and for breaking his promise to Shanks. That night, Shanks sat by the shore thinking hard. He realized Luffy's power was too dangerous for a child. If Luffy got scared or angry, whole villages could be flattened. Instead of leaving Fuchsia Village, Shanks decided to stay for a while longer. He spoke with Makino and Mayor Whoop Slap, and the red-haired pirates set up camp nearby. Shanks knew that he'd have to teach Luffy how to control himself and his powers if he hoped to live without being isolated. He already saw the fear in the villagers' eyes when they looked at Luffy. So for the next few months, Shanks trained Luffy every day. He helped Luffy control his emotions and hinted at something called haki, but Luffy didn't fully understand it. He just knew how to stay calm in a fight. Luffy learned to breathe deeply and stay calm. The training was brutal, and Luffy practiced until his head hurt. Sometimes he would accidentally make the ground tremble, but Shanks would scold him and make him start again. But in the middle of a training session, Garp appeared. He was enraged at the fact that a pirate was corrupting his grandson, and the fact that he'd allowed him to eat such a dangerous devil fruit. Garp didn't hold back. He leaped at Shanks with his fist covered in haki, and Shanks had to seriously defend himself against it. The impact rustled the trees nearby and sent a few flying. Luffy began panicking as he saw Garp and Shanks trade blow after blow. Then suddenly he screamed, and the entire forest shook from his powers. Both Garp and Shanks disengaged and went to comfort Luffy. Garp realized what this power entailed, and he and Shanks formed a truce. Garp would let Shanks train him for a bit longer before leaving. Time passed, and by the end of it, Luffy had demonstrated that he could hold his powers back. He also learned the most basic of haki coatings, and Shanks told him to continue practicing even after he left. He patted Luffy on the head, recognizing that it would be a tough road ahead. But before leaving, he gave Luffy his straw hat and told him that they'd meet again on the seas. Soon after Shanks left, Garp showed up. He took Luffy and trained him a bit more. He definitely wasn't happy that Shanks had stuck around for more time and filled Luffy's head with pirate dreams. Later on, Garp traveled to reach a small house hidden deep in the mountains. It belonged to Curly Dedan and her group of bandits. Garp dropped Luffy off and told Dedan to raise the boy with Ace. Luffy met Ace there, who didn't like him at first, but Luffy was stubborn. Sabo soon joined them. The three boys fought, argued, and laughed together. They stole food, built their secret fort, and dreamed of setting sail one day. But Luffy kept his promise to Shanks. He never used the full power of his devil fruit, not even when Ace punched him too hard or when wild animals attacked. Instead, he practiced haki. Sometimes, Ace would watch, curious. Luffy showed Ace some of the tricks Shanks had taught him. Ace started copying him, throwing harder punches and training alongside him, even though neither of them really understood what they were doing. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than any kid their age. One thing changed, though. Since Luffy wasn't there with them at the start, a few events changed, which meant that Sabo didn't run away at the time the Celestial Dragons were there. Instead, he set sail a bit later, and one way or another, Dragon ended up finding the boy adrift and took him under his wing. Ace and Luffy were sad that Sabo left, but they understood. They didn't cry. Well, Luffy almost did, but Ace punched him before he could. Years passed, and Ace soon left on his journey. More years years passed, and it was finally time for Luffy to do the same. Luffy's journey across East Blue began just like in the original timeline. First, he saved Kobe from Alvida. Luffy didn't need his devil fruit here. One punch with Haki was enough to send Alvida flying into a wall. The ship rocked a little, but Luffy laughed it off. Next, Luffy went to Shell's town and met Zoro. Zoro was tied to a post, starving and angry. Luffy freed him, and together they fought Marine Captain Morgan. Luffy used fast punches and kicks, dodging Morgan's attacks with ease. He didn't need the Quake power here either. Morgan's men ran in fear as Luffy knocked their leader out cold. Zoro joined the crew and they sailed away. In Orangetown, they met Nami and fought Buggy the Clown. Buggy was a bit tough to beat with his powers, but Luffy still managed to hold up his end of the promise. Nami joined the crew for now, but she kept it as an alliance and didn't officially join the crew. In Syrup Village, they met Usopp. The fight with Captain Kuro was a little harder. Kuro's speed and claws gave Luffy some trouble. Luffy's fists shook with power for a brief moment, the air trembling slightly, but he held back. He finished Kuro off with a strong punch that sent him crashing through several trees. Usopp joined and their small crew grew. The biggest test came at Barati, though, when Zoro challenged Draculae Mihawk, the strongest swordsman in the world. The battle was one-sided, and Mihawk easily defeated Zoro, cutting him down. Luffy's heart pounded at seeing his crewmates suffer a near-fatal blow, and he simply lost it. The ground beneath the restaurant cracked as Luffy leaped forward, and an orb of power formed around his fist. He attacked Mihawk, who quickly defended with his blade, and the vibrations shook even the sea. Mihawk pushed Luffy back and told him to restrain himself, or he'd end up damaging more than he wanted. Luffy looked around and saw the cracks on the Barati and the waves on the sea. He got scared and suppressed his power again. Mihawk left the captain and Zoro, who promised to grow stronger. Nami, witnessing Luffy's power, confided in him and asked him for help with her village. So the crew headed to Arlong Park, and this time, Luffy did not hold back. He punched the ground with both fists, and the entire building cracked. Walls fell, towers crumbled. The whole of Arlong Park collapsed like a sandcastle hit by a giant wave. The sea nearby shook, and fishermen ran for their lives. People in the nearby village stared in shock as the dust settled. Arlong was buried under rubble, defeated for good. Luffy stood in the middle of the wreckage, smiling like always, but feeling tired from holding back so much. Luffy continued forward with his journey and began using his powers a bit more in a controlled way. But there was something inside him that seemed to push him into using the full extent of his powers. He had an incredibly powerful fruit, but it required even more willpower on his part to keep himself from using that power freely. Luffy and his crew arrived at Logtown. The gang went through Logtown, where Buggy and Alvida tried to execute him, but Luffy barely flinched. When Smoker tried to capture him, Luffy used his haki to hold him back before escaping, and soon enough, the crew entered the Grand Line. In Whiskey Peak, the bounty hunters didn't stand a chance. Luffy flattened the entire hill with one overpowered stomp, not meaning to, but still grinning after. Zoro yelled at him for making the fight too easy and damaging half the town. The real trouble, though, started in Alabasta. The journey through the desert was hard, and Luffy had to fight quite a bit. When they reached Rain Base and faced Crocodile for the first time, Luffy charged in recklessly. His punches passed right through Crocodile's sand body before he began using haki. But despite this, Crocodile countered easily, stabbing Luffy with his hook and burying him deep under the desert. Luffy survived thanks to sheer stubbornness and a little help from Nico Robin, who let him escape without much care. The next time they met, things would be different. Crocodile had caused too much chaos and suffering in Alabasta, and Luffy couldn't hold back anymore. He focused his haki into his fists and learned to aim smaller, sharper tremors instead of wide, destructive waves. His punches started breaking through Crocodile's defenses, rattling the sand apart on contact. Every time Luffy landed a blow, the air rippled and nearby buildings shook. It was a massive battle, but by the end of the fight, Crocodile lay buried under the rubble of the royal palace. The ground was split. Several nearby blocks of the city were damaged. Markets, homes, and parts of the castle were reduced to piles of stone and dust. Luffy stood victorious but exhausted. While Vivi and the Straw Hats cheered for peace, the people of Alabasta stared at the destruction left behind. Some were thankful Crocodile was gone, but many were afraid of Luffy. As the Straw Hats left the country, Luffy sat at the front of the ship, staring at the sea. His friends laughed and celebrated behind him, but Luffy stayed quiet for a while, thinking about the broken streets and frightened faces. He wondered if being this strong was always going to end like this. Despite this, Luffy tried not to beat himself up too much over what had happened and continued his adventure with the crew to Skypiea. Once there, the Straw Hats enjoyed the floating island and its strange clouds, but trouble soon reared its ugly head in the form of Enel. Enel ruled the sky with fear. His observation haki was on another level, and his lightning powers were devastating. Luffy and his crew fought their way through enemies before reaching the self-proclaimed god, and the fight with Enel began through priests, trials, and traps. When Luffy finally faced Enel, the air crackled with energy. Bolts rained down toward Luffy like falling stars. Luffy jumped to the side, dodging the first few strikes. Some lightning grazed him, burning his skin, but he pushed through. Enel appeared behind Luffy in a burst of light, swinging his golden staff. Luffy ducked low, spinning on one foot. His counterpunch vibrated as a focused shockwave burst from his fist. The air rippled, and Enel's lightning form flickered, losing shape for a split second. Enel scowled, sending a massive pillar of lightning straight down. The entire ship shook. Luffy stomped the ground with both feet, releasing a wave of air pressure from below, which made the lightning scatter. Luffy launched forward, throwing a series of fast punches, each carrying small, concentrated quake bursts. Enel tried to dodge, but each shockwave spread wider than his movements. Every time he turned into lightning to slip away, the air around him shook violently, forcing his real body to reappear. Luffy closed the distance, and with both fists together, he slammed down on Enel like a hammer. A massive wave of sound and force exploded from his strike. Clouds split above them. The golden bell rang loud as the final punch sent Enel flying into the ground. The people of Skypiea were free, but again, when Luffy stood victorious, half of the upper ruins were destroyed. Some Skypians called him a hero. Others stared in disbelief at the damage left behind. Luffy kept going forward. Many adventures passed, like Water 7, CP9, and Robin's capture. By the time the Straw Hats reached Enies Lobby, Luffy had become stronger and more reckless with his Devil Fruit. He still used Haki for most small fights, but when the Going Merry carried them across the sea train and into enemy territory, Luffy didn't hold back. He tore through CP9 agents, smashing floors and walls apart with every serious punch. Bluno fell fast, unable to handle the combination of armament Haki and focused Quake blows. Then came Lucci. The fight was brutal, and Lucci's speed kept him from taking most of Luffy's blows. But each time Luffy landed a hit, the surrounding walls trembled. They were still fighting by the time the Buster Call had started, and warships began to line up the sea. Enies Lobby shook from the first round of bombardment. As the Straw Hats prepared to escape, Luffy stood at the front of the bridge with Lucci blocking him. He'd finally had enough. For the first time in public, with dozens of marine witnesses watching, Luffy unleashed the full scale of his Devil Fruit power. With both fists raised, he slammed them into the air. The sea rolled unnaturally, and the warships rocked violently. Several ships flipped over entirely. Others were split in two as massive shockwaves traveled across the water's surface. Enies Lobby itself started to crumble. Towers fell, and bridges collapsed as the entire island began to sink into the sea. The Straw Hats escaped just in time on the Going Merry. As they sailed away, Luffy stood at the stern of the ship, breathing heavily, covered in cuts and dirt, staring back at the disappearing island. His crew cheered, but Luffy didn't smile right away. The destruction he caused weighed heavy on his shoulders, and news of the event spread fast. And Luffy's bounty soon skyrocketed to a massive 600 million berries. The Marines didn't just see him as a pirate anymore. Now they saw him as a threat to the entire government. After Enies Lobby, Luffy's crew continued their journey. When they arrived at Thriller Bark, Luffy didn't waste time. Instead of playing along with Moria's shadow games, Luffy charged straight through the mansion. Walls cracked, the ground split, and with one focused Quake Blast, Luffy destroyed half the island. Oars and Moria were both flattened before they could put up much of a fight. The Straw Hats quickly rescued their friends and sailed away. Next came Sabaudi Archipelago. The crew arrived, excited about coating their ship for Fishman Island. They laughed and explored, but things took a turn for the worse when Cammy was captured and being sold. Luffy went into the human auction house, and there he saw as a celestial dragon shot Hachi down. His punch hit the celestial dragon with a quake-infused burst, and the entire auction house exploded outward. Walls collapsed, and the ceiling began to cave in. The news spread instantly. A pirate had attacked and killed a celestial dragon. The Marines responded fast as Admiral Kizaru arrived soon after. The Straw Hats tried to run, but Kizaru's light speed attacks made escape impossible. Rayleigh slowed the Admiral down, but the pacifistas were already trouble to deal with. Zoro, Sanji, and the others fought hard, but Kuma soon showed up. As Kuma began making the crew disappear with his abilities, Luffy stood frozen at first, watching his friends vanish. And when he was the last one standing, something inside of him broke. The trees began to tremble, and the ground started cracking apart. Kuma tried to reach Luffy, but the entire island shook violently. Waves slammed against the shores of Sabaudi. Kuma was caught in a sudden shockwave and thrown far back, smashing through several trees. Even Kizaru paused mid-attack, staring at the shaking earth around him. Luffy roared in anger, and massive shockwaves pulsed out in all directions. Buildings broke apart, the coastline fractured, marine ships at the docks capsized. Even Kizaru was thrown back as the vibrations disrupted his light form. But then, Rayleigh appeared. With one swift move, Rayleigh struck Luffy on the neck, knocking him unconscious before Luffy's power could tear the entire archipelago apart. Rayleigh caught him before he fell. Holding the unconscious Luffy, Rayleigh vanished into hiding, disappearing into the deep forests of Sabaudi. The Marines searched everywhere, but they couldn't find them. Sabaudi Archipelago remained broken and half-flooded for days afterward, and Luffy's name began being spoken in fear. When Luffy woke up, Rayleigh was trying to keep him composed, but then he heard the news about Ace and his impending execution. Without wasting time, Luffy searched for a way to help. He soon heard that the Whitebeard pirates were on the island, preparing to assault Marineford. He found the Moby Dick being coated in bubbles at Sabaudi. Luffy jumped aboard without thinking, and when Whitebeard's crew stopped him, Luffy stood tall, yelling about Ace being his brother. Whitebeard watched him for a while, silent and thoughtful. In the end, he allowed Luffy to stay. The Whitebeard pirates set sail toward Marineford, and Luffy went with them. And soon, the war began. The Whitebeard pirates charged in. Marines fired cannons. Giants fought on the battlefield. Admirals stood like walls, blocking every path. Luffy arrived with the others, crashing into the battlefield like a storm. His haki tore through Marine ranks, and he was using his powers more than he normally would have. Every time he punched the air, shockwaves traveled across the land and sea. Warships tipped over, and buildings shook. The execution platform stood tall in the center. Ace was chained, waiting for his final moments. Luffy ran, fighting his way through vice admirals, marines, and pacifistas. But the admirals slowed him down. Kizaru shot light beams that forced Luffy to dodge. Kuzan froze the ground, trapping Luffy's feet. Luffy broke free using small, focused quakes, but each second lost was another step closer to disaster. Marco and the Whitebeard commanders fought as hard as they could with Whitebeard leading the way, but it wasn't enough. Sakazuki climbed the platform, and before anyone could stop him, Sakazuki raised his magma fist and struck Ace through the chest. The battlefield froze. Luffy stood still, eyes wide, heartbroken. Ace's Beaver card burned to ash in Luffy's hands, and Luffy still hadn't recovered from the emotional turmoil of losing his crew. His already fragile heart snapped. The earth trembled harder than ever before. A roar burst from Luffy's throat, shaking the air itself. He slammed both fists into the ground with everything he had, and massive earthquakes tore through Marineford. Massive cracks split the island, and entire sections of Marineford sank into the sea. Tidal waves rose high, smashing ships at the harbor. Marines and pirates alike were thrown into the air. Many couldn't escape. Buildings collapsed. Soldiers and pirates were buried. Even the admirals had to retreat, moving fast to avoid the destruction. Blackbeard, who had just arrived, laughed at the chaos and saw this as an opportunity to take Luffy's devil fruit. But before he could do so, Whitebeard stepped in and blocked his path. A fierce clash erupted between the two, shaking what was left of the land, and Luffy's power gushing out made it incredibly hard to find solid footing to stand on. A tier formed between Whitebeard and Blackbeard, and Whitebeard moved back to reach Luffy. But before Luffy could tear the rest of the sea apart, Shanks arrived. With one calm, powerful burst of Conqueror's Haki, Shanks silenced the battlefield. He walked straight up to Luffy and grabbed him before another quake could form. Luffy collapsed, unconscious, exhausted from rage and pain. The war ended as the Marines and pirates retreated, leaving Marineford in ruins. The sea swallowed the remains of the island. Shanks carried Luffy away, vanishing into the horizon before anyone could follow. The world watched, stunned and afraid. Luffy's name spread once more, but this time it wasn't just for being a pirate. It was for almost sinking Marineford itself. After Marineford, Luffy was broken. He couldn't save Ace. His devil fruit had destroyed everything around him. Friends, enemies, innocent people. Shanks took Luffy far away from the battlefield. They stayed hidden on a quiet island where no Marines could reach them. And for 2 years, Shanks trained him. He took it upon himself to give Luffy a power that could destroy the world, and he wanted to make things right. Luffy learned how to focus his Quake powers without breaking everything in sight. He learned how to launch distant shockwaves, how to punch the air and crack open targets from hundreds of meters away. Haki training continued too. And by the end, Luffy stood stronger than ever. He'd found out from Shanks' sources that his crew was still alive and well, and he'd sent word that they would meet again on Sabaody after 2 years. When the training ended, Luffy smiled again for the first time in a long while. But despite this, something inside him had changed. He decided that he needed to be stronger and that he would no longer hold himself back from fear that it would lead to him losing everyone he loved, just like he did when he lost Ace. He should have sunk most of Marineford when he'd stepped on it. Soon enough, he returned to the Sabaody archipelago, and the Straw Hats reunited at the docks. They laughed, hugged, and joked like nothing had changed. But deep down, they all noticed how different Luffy had become. His steps felt heavier. His presence was stronger. The crew set sail again, heading straight for the New World. After going through various islands, they ended up on Dressrosa. A tournament was being held for Ace's Devil Fruit, but Luffy didn't care much to participate. He simply tore the tournament grounds and took the Devil Fruit by force. When Doflamingo stepped in, he was biting off more than he could chew. Luffy's punches shattered the air, breaking through Doflamingo's defenses like paper. Buildings collapsed. Streets split apart. Within minutes of their final battle, Dressrosa was reduced to rubble. The birdcage didn't even fully close before Luffy's Quake Fist blasted it apart from the inside. It wasn't until Sabo showed up and calmed Luffy down that things de-escalated. The Straw Hats were victorious, but the people of Dressrosa stared at the destruction with shock and fear, and the Marines took notice. Admiral Fujitora, already on the island, immediately called for backup. Admiral Kizaru arrived soon after, leading a full Marine assault, and the Straw Hats fought back with help from Sabo. Zoro and Sanji took on Vice Admirals, while Frankie and Robin held back squads of soldiers. Luffy himself went straight for Kizaru. The battle shook the entire coastline. Kizaru's lightspeed attacks clashed with Luffy's distant Quake punches. With each hit, shockwaves tore through the air. Luffy focused and landed a concentrated Quake burst directly into Kizaru's chest mid-flash step. The Admiral went hurtling back and got buried in a wall, but Luffy didn't let up. His focused shockwaves disrupted Kizaru's movement just enough to land powerful, Haki-infused blows. But during the chaos, Fujitora acted. Using his gravity powers, he pinned Nami and Usopp before they could escape. By the time Luffy turned, having beaten Kizaru into a pulp, he was too late. Fujitora lifted the two of them with his power and sent them flying toward a waiting Marine warship. In minutes, they were gone, taken as prisoners to Mary Jawaz. Luffy stood in the middle of the wrecked island, fists clenched, shaking with rage. Dressrosa was broken, and his friends were captured. His bounty would rise again, but Luffy only cared about getting Nami and Usopp back. Sabo tried to persuade Luffy to rethink his decision and that he would help him save his friends, but Luffy wasn't listening. He intended to chase the Marines all the way to the Holy Land. Luffy stood on the deck of the Sunny as they approached the Red Line. Mary Jawaz stood high above, home to the Celestial Dragons and the world government. Luffy wouldn't let them hide behind their walls any longer. Luffy leaped leaped from the deck and went straight for the red line itself while gathering a massive amount of power in his fists. He crashed into the massive wall, and for the first time in history, the red line visibly trembled. Cracks began to form, something once thought impossible, as chunks of rock fell like waterfalls. The sea below shook as well, and massive tsunamis battered the red line. Piece by piece, Luffy destroyed an entire section of the red line, carving out a broken, jagged path upward. A stone stairway of destruction led toward Mary Jawaz. The Straw Hats followed him, fighting their way up. Zoro cut through Marine squads as they approached them from above. Sanji soared through the air, knocking soldiers down left and right. Frankie blasted away cannons while Robin crushed officers with her giant limbs. Luffy charged ahead, fists glowing with Quake energy, Haki covering his body like armor. At the gates of Mary Jawaz, the main force of the Marines waited. Fleet Admiral Sakazuki stood at the front with Fujitora and Aramaki beside him. Behind them, the God's Knights began to line up. Luffy didn't approach them directly, though. Instead, he grabbed the sky and twisted it. A shockwave hit the front line of Marines, scattering them like leaves, and more cracks formed on the top of the red line. The nobles screamed and fled as the ground split under their feet. Palaces fell and statues cracked. Mary Jawaz, untouched for centuries, shook for the first time in history. The Straw Hats pushed forward, fighting side by side, but the enemy numbers kept growing. Despite Luffy scattering many of the Marines, the admirals were proving to be quite difficult to deal with, and Luffy had to deal with a massive brunt of attacks. And then some of the God's Knights leapt in too. They recovered fast, unnaturally fast, as if enhanced by something unknown. They couldn't stop Luffy's attacks completely as the earthquakes tore through everything. Luffy himself kept going, blood dripping from wounds, breathing hard but refusing to stop. Countless Marines and nobles died as buildings fell on top of them. But then, one by one, the Straw Hats started to fall. Chopper was crushed under rubble while trying to heal Robin. Frankie's weapons broke as he shielded Brook from a direct admiral strike. Sanji was pinned to the ground after taking too many blows. Zoro stood last among them, bloodied, cutting through Marines until he couldn't lift his swords anymore. Luffy stood alone, and the God's Knights hadn't even fully entered the battle. And in the distance, the 5 elders were standing patiently. Luffy had sustained too many injuries, and he launched one final earthquake, trying to bring everything down with him. The red line trembled one last time. Mary Jawaz mostly collapsed in the distance. But then Saint Saturn approached Luffy and pierced him through the chest with his hand. His straw hat rolled away, and his final breath left his lungs as the world fell silent. The battle was over. Mary Jawaz was in ruins. Thousands were dead, but the world government had survived. The name Monkey D. Luffy became legend as the boy who shook the world and died trying to bring it down. For more One Piece videos, make sure to subscribe and smash the like button.